In a world where judgment often comes before truth, where prejudice can outweigh facts, and where power is sometimes abused, one thing remains stronger than all of it: knowledge. James Carter wasn't just a quiet teenager. He wasn't just another face in a system that was designed to doubt him first and ask questions later. He was prepared. He was smarter than the people who tried to silence him. And because of that, he beat them at their own game. Because when the world underestimates you, you have two choices: let them, or prove them wrong. The courtroom was silent. Too silent. Everyone was watching. The judge, the lawyers, the jury. They were all staring at him. The quiet black teenager stood in the middle of the courtroom, hands clasped in front of him. His posture was straight, but his head was slightly lowered. He hadn't spoken much since the trial began. He barely reacted to anything. To most, he looked nervous, shy, maybe even guilty. But the judge? He wasn't just watching, that he was mocking. Judge Thompson leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel against his desk with a smug smirk. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Would you look at that?" The young man finally decides to speak. He chuckled, shaking his head as he looked at the audience. "Took you long enough." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The boy didn't flinch. He never did. The judge folded his arms. "Tell me, son," he continued, eyes narrowed. "Do you even understand what's happening here? Or should we dumb it down for you?" More laughter. The prosecutor smirked. Even some of the jury members exchanged knowing glances. The boy took a slow breath. His first real movement since the trial started. Then, in a voice that was calm, clear, and much stronger than anyone expected, he spoke. And when he did, the entire courtroom changed. Because the moment he opened his mouth, the world realized they had made a terrible mistake. This was no ordinary teenager. This was a genius. And he was about to destroy everything they thought they knew. Judge mocks quiet teen in court, shocked to find out he's a genius. Just 48 hours earlier, nobody knew who James Carter was. He had always been a quiet kid, the observer, the one nobody paid attention to. In school, teachers barely noticed him. Other students overlooked him. And that was exactly how he liked it. But all it took was one moment to change everything. It started at a convenience store in the middle of the night. James had only gone in to buy a bottle of water and a snack. He didn't even plan to stay long. But as he reached for his wallet, the sound of screaming erupted from the back of the store. A gunshot followed. James turned. A man in a ski mask was holding a gun at the cashier. The poor man was shaking, fumbling with the register, trying to hand over the money. James froze. He wasn't scared. He wasn't panicked. He was calculating. Because while everyone else in the store was screaming, ducking, and running, James was watching. He saw the angle of the man's grip on the gun. He saw the sweat dripping down his wrist, meaning he was nervous. He saw the faint outline of a tattoo under the sleeve of his jacket. Details. Most people would have missed them. James didn't. But before he could do anything, the sirens came. The police stormed in, yelling for everyone to get down. And then, in one of the biggest mistakes of the year, the officers' guns turned on James. "Drop the weapon. Hands in the air." James lifted his hands slowly, confused. "What? I don't." Before he could even finish, he was thrown to the ground, handcuffed, and dragged outside. The real gunman? He slipped out the back door unnoticed. The next morning, James woke up in a jail cell, accused of a crime he didn't commit. And that was how he ended up standing in front of a judge who thought he was a joke. A judge who was about to regret every word. Because James Carter was just another quiet kid in court. He was about to prove that he was smarter than every single person in the room. And he was about to blow this case wide open. Boom! A sudden noise snapped everyone's attention back to the present. The prosecutor had dropped a file on the table. "Your Honor," she said, smirking, "this young man is accused of robbery and attempted assault with a deadly weapon. But let's be honest here." She turned to James, her smile sharpening. "He doesn't exactly seem like the brightest, does he?" Laughter again. James didn't move. The judge sighed dramatically. "All right, let's get this over with. Kid, do you even have anything to say for yourself?" James looked up. For the first time since the trial began, he lifted his chin and stared directly at the judge. Then he did something that no one expected. He smiled. And when he did, the prosecutor's smirk disappeared. The judge's eyes narrowed. Because they all felt it. Something had just shifted. James wasn't afraid. He wasn't weak. And in the next 5 minutes, he was about to turn this entire courtroom upside down. The room was still. For the first time since the trial began, everyone was watching James Carter. Not as a quiet, insignificant teenager, but as something else. Something different. And the moment he smiled, the entire courtroom changed. Judge Thompson sat up slightly, his smirk fading. The prosecutor's confident posture wavered. Even the jury, who had been half bored up until now, leaned forward. Something had shifted. James Carter wasn't just standing there like a helpless kid. He was about to speak. The judge cleared his throat. "All right, son, if you've got something to say, now's your chance." James tilted his head slightly, his smile never fading. "I do, Your Honor." His voice was clear, steady. "But before I begin, I have a question." The judge frowned. "A question?" James nodded, his hands still calmly clasped in front of him. "Yes. I'd like to know if you believe in facts." A small ripple of confusion spread through the courtroom. The judge's frown deepened. "What kind of question is that?" he scoffed. James shrugged. "A simple one. Do you believe in hard, undeniable facts?" The judge scoffed, waving his hand. "Of course I do. I'm a judge. My job is to deal with facts." James nodded slowly, as if considering this. Then he said, "Good. Because I have 17 of them that prove I'm innocent." A shockwave ran through the room. The judge blinked. 17? The prosecutor's smirk faltered. James remained perfectly still. "Yes. Would you like me to list them for you?" Judge Thompson hesitated. "Go on, then." James took a deep breath. Then he began. "Fact 1. The police report says I was holding a gun." He lifted his hands, turning them palm up. "But there were no fingerprints on the weapon. No DNA. Nothing to link it to me." A murmur ran through the audience. "Fact 2. The surveillance footage." He turned slightly, addressing the room now. "The footage from the convenience store clearly shows me reaching for my wallet at the exact moment the gunshot was fired." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. James didn't stop. "Fact 3. The cashier's statement. He told officers that the man with the gun had a tattoo on his right forearm." Laughter rippled through the audience. This time, it wasn't mocking him. It was with him. The judge exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. "Fact 5. James continued, his voice stronger now. "I weigh 140 pounds. The man in the footage was at least 200 pounds. Fact 6. The shoes." He pointed to his own sneakers. "The shoe prints left at the scene didn't match mine." The prosecutor's face had gone pale. James stepped forward. "Fact 7. The police report." His sharp eyes locked onto the judge. "The report states that officers saw a black male wearing dark clothing run from the store. But I was wearing a white hoodie and jeans that night." Gasps echoed in the courtroom. James kept going. "Fact 8. The real suspect? He left through the back door. I was arrested at the front entrance." Judge Thompson shifted uncomfortably. James smiled. "Would you like me to keep going, Your Honor?" The judge looked tense now. James let the silence hang for a moment before he continued anyway. Fact 9. The fingerprint report mysteriously went missing from the case file. His gaze flicked to the prosecutor. "And I think we all know why." The prosecutor's jaw clenched. Fact 10. The officer who arrested me? His body cam footage wasn't included in evidence. Fact 11. The witness reports don't match the police statements. Fact 12. The judge slammed his gavel. "Enough." Silence. James lifted his chin slightly. He had them. The judge shifted in his seat. For the first time since the trial began, he wasn't in control. James had ripped it from him. The room buzzed with whispers. The jury members were exchanging glances. The audience was murmuring. The confidence on the prosecutor's face had completely vanished. James let out a slow breath. He wasn't done. He turned back to the judge. His next words made the room freeze. "Your Honor," he said, voice unwavering, "I'd like to call for an immediate dismissal of all charges against me." The judge stiffened. James wasn't asking. He was demanding. And when he was done, there was no way they could deny him. But the judge wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. His eyes narrowed, clinging to whatever authority he had left. "Well, young man," he said slowly, tapping his gavel. "That was quite the performance." James didn't react. The judge leaned forward. "But let's see if you can still be so confident when I make my next ruling." A chill ran through the courtroom. James felt it. The judge wasn't done playing his game. And neither was James. The judge's smirk returned. He wanted control back, and he was about to try and take it by force. James Carter saw it coming. Judge Thompson tapped his gavel twice, the sound echoing like a warning shot through the courtroom. "That was impressive, son," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You sure you're not a lawyer?" Laughter. But this time it was nervous. James didn't blink. He wasn't here to entertain anyone. He was here to clear his name. The judge leaned forward. "But let's get one thing straight. This is my courtroom. You don't get to waltz in here, play detective, and demand dismissals like you're running the show." James stayed silent, his eyes locked onto the judge. He knew what was coming. "Here's what we're going to do," Judge Thompson continued. "Since you're so confident in your facts, let's bring in a new witness." He looked at the prosecutor. "I assume we have an officer who can clarify the arrest?" The prosecutor, who had spent the last 15 minutes sweating, suddenly looked relieved. "Yes, Your Honor," she said quickly. "We have Officer Daniels, the arresting officer." James exhaled slowly. He knew exactly who Officer Daniels was. The officer who shoved him to the ground. The officer who ignored his protests. The officer who never even looked for the real suspect. And now he was about to take the stand. A side door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered white cop walked in, his uniform crisp, his movements confident. He adjusted his badge as he made his way to the witness stand. James could see it in his eyes. This man was about to lie. He had done it before. He would do it again. The judge waved a hand. "Officer, please confirm for the court. This is the young man you arrested at the convenience store?" Officer Daniels glanced at James, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Did you find him in possession of a firearm?" "Yes, sir," the officer said smoothly. "The suspect matched the description given to us. Black male, dark hoodie, seen running from the scene. When we arrived, he refused to cooperate. That's when we detained him." James clenched his fists. "Lies." The judge smirked. "Well, there you have it," he said, spreading his arms. "Straight from the arresting officer himself. You were there. You resisted. And now, you're trying to talk your way out of it." He shook his head in mock disappointment. James exhaled slowly. They weren't going to let him win. They had made their decision before he even walked into this courtroom. The room had gone silent, waiting for James to respond. The prosecutor had a satisfied look on her face again. The jury was still watching, their expressions mixed. But James didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply reached into the folder his lawyer had placed on the table and pulled out one single piece of paper. Then, he held it up. Officer Daniels frowned. "What's that?" James turned it around. It was the police department's internal memo. A memo that stated Officer Daniels' body camera was mysteriously turned off during the arrest. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The officer's face drained of color. James' voice was steady. "If I was resisting arrest, why didn't you turn in your body cam footage?" Officer Daniels didn't answer. James wasn't done. "Let me help you with that," he continued, his voice cutting through the silence. "Your camera was off because you knew this arrest wasn't right. You tackled me before even asking who I was. You didn't check the security footage. You didn't ask the cashier. You saw a young black kid and assumed I was guilty." Murmurs grew louder in the courtroom. The judge's smirk was gone. The prosecutor was stiff as a statue. Officer Daniels looked trapped. James pressed forward. "Fact 13, he said, voice rising. "I wasn't the only one in that store. There was a white man, about 6 feet 2 inches, wearing a dark hoodie, standing right next to me. But you didn't even look at him, did you?" The officer's jaw tightened. James stepped toward him, his voice like a blade. "Because you weren't looking for a suspect." He let the words hang, sharp and cutting. "You were looking for someone who fit your idea of a criminal." The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Whispers. Even the jury looked rattled now. The officer's hands curled into fists. James didn't care. James slowly rolled up his sleeves, showing his bare skin. I don't have any tattoos. Judge Thompson leaned forward. James continued. Fact 4. The robber's voice. The recording from the security cameras captured a voice yelling. That voice was deep, gritty, but my voice. He shrugged. Not exactly a match. He turned back to the judge, his confidence unshakable now. Your Honor, he said, I have more than enough evidence to prove I was falsely accused. But right now, I just need you to answer one question. The judge looked visibly uncomfortable now. James' voice was calm, but his words were sharp. Are you going to let this case be about justice or about saving face? The tension in the room was unbearable. The judge stared at James. James stared back. And in that moment, everyone knew. Judge Thompson was out of moves. But what he did next, no one saw coming. The courtroom was frozen in silence. Every eye was on Judge Thompson, waiting, watching, to see what he would do. James Carter stood firm, his words still hanging in the air like an unbreakable truth. Are you going to let this case be about justice or about saving face? For the first time, the judge didn't have a comeback. His gavel hovered over the desk, his fingers twitching. His face was tight, his jaw clenched, but his usual smug confidence? Gone. The murmurs in the room grew louder. The jury was whispering among themselves. The audience members, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding in agreement, were waiting for his response. And James? He knew he had won. But the judge, he wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, gripping his gavel as if it was the last thing keeping him in control. This is highly irregular, he muttered, his voice lacking the arrogance it held before. The court does not take kindly to. He stopped mid-sentence, because James wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking past him, straight at the entrance of the courtroom. The doors swung open, and in walked Detective Marcus Allen. The entire room shifted. Detective Allen was one of the most respected investigators in the department. Unlike Officer Daniels, he had a reputation for fairness, and more importantly, he wasn't corrupt. He stepped forward, holding a folder in his hand. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady, I have new evidence that has just come to light. The prosecutor visibly tensed. The judge's eyes darted between James and the detective. What is the meaning of this? He demanded. Detective Allen didn't hesitate. He opened the folder and pulled out a photo. This is a still frame from the convenience store's rear security camera, which wasn't included in the original evidence files. He turned it around so the entire court could see, and there, as clear as day, was a man in a black hoodie sprinting out the back door, his face fully visible. Not James, a completely different man. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shocked murmurs. Some people even stood up in disbelief. James didn't smile this time. He just exhaled, his heart pounding in his chest. He had known the truth all along. But now, so did everyone else. Judge Thompson was pale. He turned to Officer Daniels, his expression dark. You were the arresting officer, he said slowly. Why was this footage not included in the case files? Daniels opened his mouth, then closed it. He was trapped, and he knew it. The prosecutor tried to recover. Your Honor, while this is... But the judge cut her off. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. He looked at James. He looked at the jury. He looked at the entire courtroom, now filled with eyes full of judgment toward him. Then at last he picked up his gavel and banged it down. Case dismissed. The room erupted. James felt his knees weaken for just a second, the adrenaline finally catching up to him. It was over. The judge stood quickly, gathering his papers, avoiding eye contact. He knew his career would never be the same. Officer Daniels slipped out of the courtroom, his head low, knowing that he would have to answer for what he had done. And the prosecutor? She sat stone-faced, defeated. James turned to the audience. Among the faces watching him, he saw a black mother holding her young son's hand. She nodded at him, because now, that little boy knew that fighting back mattered, that the truth could still win. James walked out of the courtroom, feeling the fresh air hit his skin like freedom itself. But before he left the courthouse steps, a voice called out behind him. Detective Allen. He walked up to James, slipping his hands into his pockets. You handled yourself well in there, he said. James turned to him, studying his face. You knew the truth, didn't you? Detective Allen shrugged. I suspected it. But you? You proved it. He looked at James a little differently now. With respect, James nodded once. Because at the end of the day, he had never been the criminal. He had been the smartest person in the room. And now, the world knew it too. This story isn't just about a courtroom. It's about something bigger. It's about the power of truth. The power of knowing your rights. The power of never letting someone else write your story for you. If the story made you feel something, don't just sit in silence. Hit that like button to show the world that truth always wins. Drop a comment below. Tell me, what would you have done if you were in James' shoes? And most importantly, subscribe for more powerful, eye-opening stories that remind us. The smartest person in the room isn't always the loudest. Sometimes, it's the one nobody sees coming.